stumbled upon a video of a mutual of mine, and I've been thinking about it ever since. I've noticed a recent trend on social media where historical women are portrayed as either a victim or completely powerless. And I think we may have lost the plot a little bit. And I may have contributed to this problem a little bit. I mean, there is only so much information you can deliver through a short video. Let's rectify things and add nuance to the conversation. When analyzing historical figures, we have to be careful not to project our own feelings onto the person, but rather try to let them speak and put ourselves in their shoes. In this video, I will specifically be analyzing the lives of Anne Boleyn and Lady Jane Grey. But let me preface this by saying that I am by no means an expert on English or Tudor history, but I think these are two interesting examples of female agency in a historical context. I have to say, the painting of Lady Jane Grey is one of my favorite pieces of art ever, and I can only dream of one day having the skills to draw my favorite historical and mythological scenes. And this is why Skillshare is the sponsor of this video. The platform has many classes that teach different skills. In the art section, you can learn how to draw comics, how to watercolor, or how to stay inspired as an artist. I personally wanted to acquire the basics before I delve into a more specialized form of drawing, so that's why I joined the beginner's guide. You learn about shapes, how to draw outlines, proportions, and contouring. I love the idea of building a daily art habit. It can be just 15 to 30 minutes every day where you practice your drawing, and over time your skills will improve dramatically. Real progress doesn't happen overnight. It's one small step at a time. Joining a class on Skillshare helps you stay motivated and build a creative momentum. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today! When we approach the subject of victimization, we have to realize that it can also be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it can absolve you of responsibility in a situation where you have been wronged. And let's face it, nobody wants to be blamed for their own misfortune. And there are many examples of historical women who have been blamed for something they had no control over. However, the flip side is that victimization strips you of your agency. Whoever holds the blame also holds the power. So let's go back to Anne Boleyn. By portraying her as completely powerless in her relationship with Henry VIII, we risk denying her autonomy and her ability to make choices, even if those choices were flawed and led to a horrible situation. Here's the thing, I understand why people try to portray her as completely powerless in her relationship with Henry, as if she was placed in the position of queenhood against her will. They want to empathize with her and show her in a favorable light. But this approach of pure victimization also diminishes her complexity and to some extent infantilizes her. In 1526, Henry VIII became enamored with Anne and began his pursuit. They were both skilled at courtly love, which was a conventionalized tradition of flirting between nobles. They were constantly exchanging love letters without having had any intimate relationship. While Henry's love for Anne is well documented in his letters, people argue about Anne's feelings toward him. She initially refused to be his mistress and retreated to Hever Castle where she corresponded with him. However, we can't assume that she wasn't interested in him because she didn't immediately show interest. In fact, one of the main characteristics of courtly love was that the lady had to be inaccessible. The point was to build tension between the lovers so that the knight's devotion would be challenging. This game of courtly love was a tradition since medieval times and was written about in Arthurian legends. We have to understand that Anne was raised with this culture and she most likely internalized it. A woman who properly played her role in this dynamic would not just immediately succumb to the man's first attempt. And let's be honest, I have a hard time believing that Anne was completely disinterested by the advances of the King of England. Let's remember, Anne was not considered to be a high enough rank to marry her previous love, Henry Percy, who would become Earl. Now she was getting the advances of a king. At that same time, Henry was unhappy in his marriage. He and Catherine had no living sons, which means no heir, which is a pretty big deal for a king who wants a successor. All of Catherine's children died in infancy except for Mary. Henry's feelings for Anne, coupled with her refusal to become his mistress, probably contributed to his desire to annul his marriage. We have to remember, to succeed in the treacherous waters of the Tudor court, you needed to have some level of ambition. And Anne certainly did have some. She saw an opportunity in Henry's dissatisfaction in his marriage and his infatuation with her. Anne refused to settle as another mistress who could easily be discarded. Wink wink, like her sister. She had her eyes on the bigger prize. Yes, she aspired to become the queen, a goal that most women of her status would not have even dared to entertain. In this case, Anne certainly did have agency, and perhaps even more than Henry, since she was ultimately legitimized as the Queen of England. Her marriage with Henry was so significant that it would be the reason behind England's separation from the authority of the Pope. That is a huge deal, one of the biggest political moves caused by a woman in history. You could argue that she gained more from this marriage than Henry did, and she worked a long time to reach that position. It would take 7 years of dating and courtship before Anne finally became Queen of England. This girl knew what she wanted. Unfortunately, she paid the price of her grand ambition by losing her life. High risks can yield high results, but they also come with high consequences. Ultimately, she was powerless in the last moments of her life. After the infatuation died down and after she gave birth to a daughter, which was a major disappointment for Henry, she was no longer in a position of power in her relationship. She was at the mercy of her husband's whims and desires, even though that was the position she had sought in the first place. It is a very human tragedy, and I think we can empathize with Anne in this gut-wrenching moment where she is separated from her 2-year-old daughter and then executed. We can empathize with her without denying her autonomy and the decisions she made that led to this very situation. Analyzing historical women doesn't have to be black or white. There are many shades of gray in between. You do not have to be the perfect angelic victim for me to have sympathy for you. And on the other hand, you don't have to be the badass independent Wonder Woman for me to respect you. Both visions are an extreme and a caricature of womanhood. Being human means making mistakes, being selfish, prioritizing your own needs and desires over others, falling in love with the wrong person, and navigating the messy and unpredictable nature of life. These imperfections are part of the human drama and are what make human beings so interesting. And just to make things clear, victimization is a very real experience for many historical and modern women. But my point is that it shouldn't be the only lens through which we analyze women. People are multifaceted with moments of strength and vulnerability, and I think both should be acknowledged equally. I would say that agency can be placed on a spectrum. On one end, there is complete powerlessness, and on the other end, there is maximum agency. And most people fall somewhere in between, and your positioning also can vary depending on your circumstances. Every person has a certain amount of agency over their lives. Granted, not everyone has the same amount of agency. For example, a child has much less agency than an adult, but they still have some level of control and power over their destiny. A child doesn't choose to go to school, but he chooses the friends he makes, the effort he puts in his homework, and the behavior he exhibits in class. Likewise, women historically have had less agency than men. In fact, they were constantly under male guardianship. First her father and then her husband. Nonetheless, they did make decisions within these parameters and sometimes even exceeded expectations. They also could influence the decisions of the men in their lives, which gave them indirect power. Now let's discuss Lady Jane Grey. Lady Jane Grey is often cited as an example of a female victim. And let me be clear, Lady Jane Grey was for the most part powerless in the circumstances that she fell into. However, she did exercise agency in one crucial moment, and I think it should be highlighted. Let's go back to this portrait. It is very popular among art and history circles. I've also covered it in one of my videos and even seen it in real life. It is absolutely stunning. Lady Jane Grey was executed at the age of 17 as shown in this portrait. At first glance, you would think that she was completely powerless in her last moments. But now let's try to understand how she viewed this moment. What was her perspective? After Henry VIII's death, Edward was named king and he continued to implement the Protestant religion. To ensure that England would remain Protestant, he named his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as his successor over Mary, who was Catholic. After Edward's death, Lady Jane Grey was named queen for about 2 weeks until support for Mary started to gain momentum. Jane then stepped out of the position without any resistance, but she would be convicted of treason a few months later. Her life was spared by Mary, who pardoned her. However, things took a bad turn when Jane's father was found to be part of a group who conspired against Mary and her implementation of Catholicism. Even though Lady Jane Grey had nothing to do with the conspiracy, she was now a definite threat to the crown and had to be dealt with. Mary didn't actually want to kill her cousin, but she accepted her counsel's advice. She signed the order of the execution for Jane and her husband. It was initially scheduled for February 9th, 1554, but Mary postponed it for 3 days to give Jane the opportunity to convert to Catholicism. Mary offered to spare their lives if Jane and her husband converted. Jane would not have been fully freed had she converted, but she most likely would have been well treated under imprisonment, similar to how Mary, Queen of Scots, was well treated while imprisoned by Elizabeth I. Jane's conversion would have made her less of a threat to the crown, hence why she was given this option. However, Jane was an extremely devout Protestant and she refused. Through this action alone, she displayed strength and bravery by remaining true to her faith and to her convictions, and that is the part that is missing when we only portray her as a victim. Empowerment can take many forms, and in my opinion, that is one instance of it. Here's a written account of an eyewitness present in the tower on the day of Jane's death. Jane, we are told, is nothing at all abashed, neither with the fear of her own death, neither with the sight of the dead carcass of her husband. She came forth, the lieutenant leading her in the same gown wherein she was arraigned. Neither her eyes anything moistened with tears, although the 2 gentlewomen, Mistress Tilney and Mistress Ellen, wonderfully wept. Jane carried a book in her hand whereon she prayed all the way to the said scaffold. Another source writes, she conducted herself at her execution with the greatest fortitude and godliness. With her hand on the block, Jane spoke the last words of Jesus as recounted in the Gospel of Luke. Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit. The axe then fell and Jane was beheaded in one clean stroke. This woman, this girl, was unfazed after seeing the corpse of her husband. She did not cry, did not succumb to pressure, and she was only 16, 17. That is remarkable and just shows how strong she was. It's also interesting to note that although Mary was the queen and signed the execution order, she actually exercised less agency than Lady Jane Grey, who held on to her convictions until the end and was executed for it. With these 2 examples, we can reflect on the idea of agency and we realize that it's not as straightforward as it seems. Do you have control over your destiny, or are you simply a pawn? You could execute the perfect plan and see your house of cards crumble before you, or you could be in a desperate situation and decide to be the master of your own destiny. Food for thought. I hope you enjoyed, guys, and I would love to read your thoughts in the comments. Bye.